and stuff, and it just kind of just cut off.
Yeah.
Maybe it's back up now.
Yeah, I see.
Oh, that's how I did that. Okay.
What programming language are we working in?
C#, but this will be general. It will be general tips. Okay, general tips, yeah.
Okay, that's always good.
I think it's my just network provider, internet provider. It's jumping very much.
Yeah, probably. Are you going to be doing anything in Visual Studio today at all? Because that might be, at least as far as everything outside of the slides go, that'll get rid of a lot of the latency problems.
Yeah,
Well,
but
the latency won't be as bad, I should
yeah.
say.
We'll see, we'll see. I think in the end I always like to have something practical.
Gotcha.
It's like the Twitch stream is like probably a minute and a half off of what our actual conversation is.
Yeah, I will try to. I will give you the slides actually, so that you don't lag behind, and the ones who watch Twitch also don't lag behind. So we're all in sync, okay? Except
That
the
sounds fine
questions
with
will
me.
be out of sync a bit. So lesson channel is slides.
Lesson channel has slides. There we go. Let's see if I can save it to my computer. Save,
Bam! Look at that.
download as save file. Yeah, this computer's a laptop, by the way, but pretty much a desktop.
Hey, nothing wrong with a laptop, man.
I got one from Digital Storm though, and I put a 2 terabyte A60 Pro in it and a 1 terabyte 970 Pro. So won't be
Very
running out
nice.
of won't be running out of disk space for a while.
Yep. Okay, let's get started. So the topic of this lesson is clean code, and it's gonna be about the very basics, basically stuff that you don't really need to, for which you don't really need to have any prior knowledge, and it helps for every language that you're gonna write code for. It's universal and very nice. How to make your code better, more maintainable, easier to understand both for you and for others. So here goes. So what is clean code? Clean code consists of three things. It's easy to read, understand, and maintain. And I think most of us have been in a situation where, at least at the start, where you look at your code and everything is in one file, and it has like 1,000 lines of code, and then you're like scrolling down, 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 down till you find the line you need to edit, and then you scroll back up, 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 up till you want to change something back up. And then when something goes wrong, you scroll back and forth, and that's an example of what a dirty code looks like. Why do we need clean code? The thing is that most of the time we read our code. Very rarely, I mean, most of the time we read our code, and the ratio of reading to writing is like 1 to 10, 1 to 9 more like. Uh, so the dirtier our code is, the more time it takes us to remember what code we wrote, what went wrong. Um, it's harder for other people to understand what you wrote, and um, yeah, that's it. The purpose of your code is just unknown, and you don't really, like, no one will be able to understand what you wrote without you explaining them, or without an immense amount of time trying to understand. So clean code gives good long-term results because it improves our productivity, because we no longer need to spend unnecessarily a lot of time reading code. Instead, we can spend a bit more time writing code to make it more expressive and readable. And sometimes when your boss or colleague or team lead asks you how many, like, how good is your code, or how much effort did you put in your code, and then you say, I wrote this many lines, like thousands of lines of code, and that measurement is quite bad, as it doesn't really say anything, especially about the code quality. The best measurement of code quality is what the fucks per minute. If someone looks at your code and everything is clear, what the fucks per minute will be minimal. You will barely notice that something is like non-standard, weird, exotic looking. Everything will be clear. Actually, not everything. Nothing is ever completely clear, but most of the stuff that you wrote will be clear. So that's what clean code is all about. So the first
Isn't
thing,
that where?
yeah?
Sorry, isn't that where properly notating, inserting note lines into your code would also come in?
No, that's a bad thing actually, and I'll explain why.
Okay.
So the first thing about code that you should pay attention to is naming. And that's the hardest thing that programmers have to do. Properly naming stuff solves many problems. Properly naming stuff also is very hard. And that's why there are plenty of rules of how to have good names for stuff that you name. So first, names. So first, how should you name your variables, or anything really? Names should be unambiguous. If you look at the first example, you have a lesson. You have int lesson equals 1, as opposed to int l equals 1 or int index equals 1. Like, what is that index for? Or what is the meaning of L? I will not know without context, but reading the line on the left, I will understand what the 1 is for. It's lesson, probably an index for lesson. Now, if let's say you have a lesson as a class and lesson as index, you should separate those. And you shouldn't separate those with types, as on the right, but you should separate those with a meaningful name. Lesson index will be 1 and lesson object will be just lesson, as lesson implies on some entity. You shouldn't write type in the end, as it is unnecessary noise. You should name it what it is, based on logical and not semantical purpose. Semantics, I mean types. You should call it what it's supposed to do or be used for. Less than index means that it will be used for indexing. Maybe the first index of a lesson is 1. That's why I store it in that variable. So the third rule is that names should be short and contain meaningful info. For example, if you look on the left, we have a single shop, and we see that shop gets created, and in parameters we pass Taylor. And on the right we see Taylor shop, and Taylor shop gives us absolutely no info. It would make maybe more sense if we had multiple shops, but for a single shop, that single word would be enough. Obviously, I saw that students in the beginning, when they start programming, they sometimes write in their own language, and that's a bad thing, because the keywords of a language are usually in English. All conventions are based in English, and by writing it in your own language, you simply break those. So you should conventionally write everything in English when you're coding, even comments. And code should be pronounceable, readable. Pronunciation and simply amount of time it takes for you to read a word matters. For example, we have sly as a trait, and we have mischievous, which basically means the same thing. Sly, it takes us very little time and little effort to pronounce, but mischievous, I almost broke my own tongue while reading that. So you should pay attention to it when deciding on a name. It should be pronounceable, easily pronounceable. Now, if there are exceptions though, that when something is consistently bad but consistent, and if your team has some rules for naming, it doesn't matter that those rules break conventions. For example, your team somehow says that they will comment stuff in their own language, then they should do that, and you should do that, because that's the convention of your team. For example, if you say that every number will have num in the end when you call name a variable, then you should have that, if that's what you decide as a team. So if you have a convention with arbitrary agreement, then you should follow it, even if it's not standard. Otherwise, follow standard. And lastly, do not use keywords. For example, console or string. Like, just one name as a string is impossible to achieve. Console as a name is very bad, as you will not be able to use console in something that's named console. I mean, let's say a namespace named console will be a bad namespace. And that's a mistake I made yesterday by doing a presentation. PPF, console, forms, or form is even worse. It's a keyword that you should avoid, especially when you're working with it. Like, if I'm working with console, and if I have console as a namespace, that's a bad thing, as it will mix in really nastily with the actual console, the keyword that's it's used for. In C#, we have a choice of either explicitly naming our types or implicitly via var keyword. Var means that we can predict what the value is. The compiler will predict what it is. So when should you use which? So in general, prefer var over type because it's faster and easier, but a more interesting case is when you would like to specify what type it is explicitly. So when it's hard to tell what the type is, it should be explicitly typed, named. For example, in our case, we have amount. Is amount an integer, or is it a float, a double, decimal, short, single? I don't know. I can find out by looking at a get amount method, and I see that it's int, but for stuff which requires lookup, double reference, I shouldn't waste time for that, for something as simple. So by writing int, you save time by specifying that this is an int, and even though the method name doesn't say what it is, the type that you wrote says what it is. That's why in that case, writing var is a bad thing. It's a bad thing because it causes confusion, and it takes time to clear that confusion. For our second case, we sometimes might want emphasis on what type a variable is. It's a main controller, it's an important controller, it's very important, and we want to express the importance with a type. So we specify the type main controller instead of just writing var. Even though in most cases when you say new var, you can infer the type from the type that you use to create something. And again, if it's a team convention, use type explicitly over var. In other cases, by default, you should use var because it provides no extra info. Like with var, you don't lose anything, you don't lose any info, and providing a type when type is obvious is just redundant because it doesn't give you any extra info. So it's faster to write that way, and sometimes you simply don't care what the type is and you just want to pass it around. There are those cases. And if you want to familiarize yourself better with the conventions, how you should write code based on the standard that C# has, there are two sources. The first one refers to community source, and this chart comes from the community source. It's a listing of basically what notation you should use for naming different things, what's the length of different objects, should it be plural or not, should it have a prefix or not, suffix or not, and so on and so forth.
Will each language have its own standards of conventions like this, or is this pretty universal?
Each language has its own, but they overlap quite a lot. For example, in JavaScript, you write brackets in the same line as a function name, and it's called Egyptian brackets because of, you know, the gesture that Egyptians do. And in C# you write it in a separate line. So yeah, you have official Microsoft Docs, that's the best place to refer to, and a bit simplified version is community source. Do you have any more questions about naming stuff, or confusion, or examples of when you're not sure how to name stuff? Then I
I
shall.
don't think I do. I don't know about anybody else.
Okay, I shall continue. So, comments. The thing that people are most confused about, actually, I think the biggest misconception that there is, that you also mentioned, is that you think that comment helps you understand code better, which I agree to an extent. The problem with comments is, though, that they often grow old fast, and code with comments requires double maintainability. Comment becomes an accuracy quite fast, basically a gossip, which in time transforms into a lie. And that kind of a comment, which doesn't tell what the line does or what the code does, and actually tells maybe something opposite, is the worst thing that you can actually do. One of the worst things in code that you can do. So, why do you need comments? Those are the good parts of comments, when you should write them. They're perfect when you're learning something, when you want to mark notes, when you want to simply explain something that's not obvious. Comment is great. Comment is great in professional aspect when you have something which will cause consequences which you are not aware of as someone who looks in the code for the first time. Consequences which matter a lot, and which are not obvious just reading the code. And sometimes it's just too hard to come up with a name good enough to express what the code should do. And in that case, a comment comes in handy.
So would an acceptable use of a comment be in a situation where you have a um, a line of code that calls another function from another part of the project, and instead of relying on the person to go and look at that function to see what it does, you would just put a comment on that line saying calls function to tally total sales for the month and set them equal to this variable or something like that. Would that be an acceptable instance?
No, it's not acceptable. As you can name the function something like calculate salary instead of saying calculate salary from this project based on this in a comment. A name of a function which represents the intention is much better. Also, keep in mind that details, a comment should not contain details unless those details are something that is very important and not obvious and needed for everyone who uses that function to understand. So in your case, a detail where the function gets called, I think, is not that important, as it can change, and thus the comment will have to change. So that kind of comment seems to require extra maintainability, as with a change to function you will need to change the comment. And another thing is that you can easily rename your function instead to tell what it does. It doesn't matter about the details unless those details really matter. If I need to look what the function does, how it works, I'll look inside it. But if you would do what you just said for every function, then you would have basically duplicate code. I mean, annotations for every method that you call, and you would basically write in human language the same thing that your code did, more or less, which is unnecessary. I understand that it might be like at the high level of your code, somewhere high, but the whole point of programming is that you should not be dependent on details, you should be dependent on abstractions. So exposing details via comment is a very bad idea. you should avoid doing it, and when you want to do it, you should rename your code instead. Alright, did that answer the question?
Yes, actually. Thank you.
Okay. So why you do not need them? Code speaks for itself. Like I explained, if you consider writing a comment, you should consider renaming code better. So good name is much better than a good comment. Comments are noise in your code. When you read a comment, basically when you have a line of code and a comment, you read 2 lines instead of 1. So it is noise. It disrupts readability. And it's a level, like human level mixed with less human level. So you mix levels and it's not a nice thing. And writing a comment in most cases should feel like a defeat, because you were not able to express yourself good enough. You failed to name a method, a variable, a class in a way which would be understandable just by looking at it. You had to do some nasty cheat, some lazy workaround called a comment. So when you write a comment, you should feel defeated and ashamed. And now examples. There are so many examples where I saw something like this. I look at the class and there's a method called initialize components, and then above that method there's a comment, initializes components. That is the biggest garbage comment that anyone can write. The worst kind of comment. Gives no extra info, is noise. So don't write comments for the obvious. It's bad. When you look in a function, you sometimes have numbers. Some number multiplied from another number multiplied from a variable, and those returned to another function or passed to another function. Don't do it. So don't use magic numbers. Those numbers are magic numbers. I'll be a bit interrupted. Sebastian asked about tools of encryption, and I actually don't know, as it requires more context. But I would suggest researching and looking for a NuGet package. If you're talking about C#, a NuGet package which works with encryption. I personally have not worked with it that much, so I have no preference and I cannot answer the question, though it's also out of scope of this lesson. Alright, so back to the comments and tips. So let's say you have an example for comments in slides. Are you watching the same slide as I do?
Are you on slide 13 right now? The comments, tips.
Wait a minute. Yes, I am. Okay. So basically, you have example on the right. It is a bad example. Example of a bad comment. First line is an obvious comment. Second line is an obvious comment. Third comment is something which can be explained better with renaming. Fourth comment is something which explains magic numbers. You have 0.85, you have 0.99, and you have 1.07. What are those numbers? I don't know. They're magic numbers. And you should avoid those, and instead of a magic number, have a constant with a name. So if you look on the left side, you see a constant float, and you see tax. So 0.85 is a tax, some tax 1 rate, tax 2 rate, and then a bonus. And then in the end, you see how salary gets calculated after taxes. You multiply salary from tax 1, then tax 2, and then bonus, and you return it. That's your salary. That's how you calculate actual salary from base salary. Name salary here as a parameter could also be better because it's base salary. It's not just any salary. So by calling it base salary, you increase clarity even more. So don't use magic numbers. Use named constants instead of writing a comment and explaining what that number is for. And again, if you consider writing a comment, you should rename your functions or functions, variables, classes, or restructure them. Now, functions. The thing about functions is that about code in general, if code is clean, you should have the same feeling reading clean code as reading a book. Everything is laid down in chapters, in sections, in sentences, in paragraphs, in sentences and words. Everything is nice and neat. And this is because, just like in a book, you refer to the context. I think that's the English name. To look up something that you're interested in, like a chapter, like a paragraph, or something.
I think that would be an index or a table of contents.
Yeah, index. So you refer to index to find the content that you want. And that's why having clean code, just like having a clean index, helps us a lot. So writing code is much like writing a book. You start with words, from those you make sentences. So you start with variables, with keywords, and you make up functions, small functions of those. You group small functions into bigger functions, and those are called paragraphs. And then you fit those into classes, and those are called chapters. And then your whole project could be considered a book, and solution tome, a selection of books. So the thing about small functions, the first thing about functions is that they should be small. Function should not be more than 20 lines of code in most cases. There are exceptions though. When a function is heavily related on data, so those more than 20 lines can be purely fields that an entity contains. But then again, that just means that your entity is too big and should be split and divided into smaller parts and composed of those parts. So in 90%, more than 90% of the time, it should be 20 lines at most, around 20 lines. So if you look at the example, even though it looks like the left side has more code than the right side, but if you look at the right side, it's just a garbled mess that I have no idea what's going on. And if you put those write lines and read lines into context, you start seeing that there is a pattern. So I can translate that code into 3 steps, and by splitting the code, one big function, into smaller functions which represent steps, I create quite easily readable code. So you have function 1, step 2, and step 3, and function step 1, step 2, and step 3. Just the way you laid your functions down, you laid method definitions down. They should follow the order, the sequence of how you call them. Also, the thing about this is that um, um, code like this, if you look at it, it it should remind you the mentioned structure of a book. So you know what happens by reading main method. You know that step 1 happens, and then step 2 happens, and then step 3 happens. That's all you need to know. If you wanted to know details, then you would look. If you wanted to know what step 1 does, then you would look at step 1. If you wanted to know what step 2 does, then you would look up step 2. So having those small functions and having a bigger function divided into smaller functions lets you have a chapter, a paragraph-like structure where you have higher level things which tell what it does without telling how it does. And you should, in programming, you should avoid exposing details as much as possible. Always. So a function should do one thing, and this is an example of how a bad function looks like. You say you call your function process, and that function logs, writes, cleans, and then reads from database something. It's ridiculous, and it should never be that way. If it is, then, well, first about this function, I don't know what it does, and I don't think there would be a context from which I could understand what this function would do without looking inside of it. So a function should be split into steps, and those steps should not be called in like one big function like this unless they can be they are truly a part of that bigger function. In this case, they're not. Maybe you had a button which reads from database, writes to XML, cleans, logs, and does that. And then you should, instead of calling process function, do those things that you have, those 5 things, because they are not that related. And even better, logging should be split, so instead of forcing to log it, you could shoot an event and signal that you can log something. Clean should be also based on an event, something that needs to be cleaned, can be cleaned independently. So function should do one thing and do it well. That's the core concept, both of object-oriented and function-oriented programming, functional programming. And that's it. There were other things I wanted to cover, but didn't have time to make. Do you have any questions?
No, just a lot of introspection. I think I have a lot of work to do on my other project to clean it.
Yeah. And it's a huge misconception, especially about comments. People say, "Oh my God, I didn't write comments. My code is so dirty." No, your code is not dirty because of comments, of lack of them. It's because you named stuff poorly. You know, when you write code, if you stop doing what you're doing and spend like a minute or two thinking on a name of an important part, module of your code, and just name it better, you would in the end save so much time, and a comment would be avoided. Because another thing about comment is that a comment is just, especially inline comments, is just some line of code. I mean, it's not even code, it's just a note, a notation. If you decide to write a comment though, there is this what you should do. Since you're the only one here on Discord, I'll share you the collaboration and we can jump on Visual Studio.
Okay. I mean, give me a second to open Visual Studio.
I'm super upset about my internet still, that it's behaving as it is right now.
Okay. You're gonna have to remind me how to connect to a collaboration. Again, it's in.
Sorry, what?
I can't remember how to connect to a collaboration project. Is it in Tools?
File. It's in File.
File. Yeah, that's what I said. Didn't you hear me? I said it's in File, right?
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm growing old. Not everyone is perfect. I wasn't in the military, okay? Untrained recruit. Okay.
Oh man.
Good times, right? Good times.
Oh yes.
So, if you look to Inertia Mage game presentation project and program CS file, line 20.
Okay.
And method step 1, write 3 slashes, please.
Above, below, or in the method?
Above the method.
Above the method.
Backslash. The other slash.
Yeah, I realized my mistake about a half a second after.
Okay, so it didn't work for you, but if you did this in your own Visual Studio, it would do this.
Ah.
Have you done this?
I have never done that.
Okay, so what this is, it's official style for commenting. It's called XML docs, and this is what C# in general .NET supports, so Visual Basic as well. When I don't know if VBA supports it, maybe.
I've never seen VBA because in VBA, well, in VB, your comment lines are
true,
that.
True.
And I've never had to do that before.
True. Anyways, this means that I think it has to have something like that.
It definitely has commentability, but I've never
like
seen
this,
like a
something
summary
like this.
this.
I'll look into it. So what this means is that if you say something like initial step of a main program. It's a bad comment, but I'm just doing this as an example.
Right.
So if I call this here and hover over it, you see my comment. Initial step of a main program. So this basically lets me have stuff, descriptions, which will be displayed by IntelliSense. So anywhere in my code, if I hover over this method, I'll see its description because I used the official docs supported by language. And I'm pretty sure that VB has something similar.
I'd almost guarantee it. If it's a .NET thing, then I almost guarantee VB.NET has something similar.
Java
VBA,
has it also, yeah.
VBA is a little bit different because VBA doesn't run off of the .NET framework.
Yeah.
It uses Microsoft Office, Word, Excel, Outlook, what have you, as its framework. So I don't know if that's in VBA. I don't actually. I know for a fact that it's not, because in the VBA ICE, I think is what it's called. Um, you can't hover over like a variable
Oh, okay.
or a function and have it display something, which I personally am really annoyed by, because I use Notepad++ and I use Visual Studio, and I love that both of those will do that. But it's not in the Visual Basic editor, which is really annoying to me.
VBA
Microsoft
editor.
kind of Microsoft kind of it started ignoring that thing around 2005.
Mm-hmm.
Which is depressing. But
And it's not just Excel and Microsoft, it's and Office, but it's more you can use it outside of those, as I have had the need to do it. Actually, I might be wrong, as it's called VB6, VB Classic, which is what I've worked on in VBA. You might be right that it's exclusive to those. Though VBA and VB6, I think that's very similar or the same thing, but I'm not sure.
I think so. That sounds like it's in line with things that I've read.
Hmm. Maybe it's a slightly simplified or modified version of VB6 VBA. But like when I look stuff for VB6, because I had to work with legacy systems, so I would see no difference between resources about VB6 and VBA, as they're both outside .NET
Mm-hmm.
and look identical to me. Okay. So what do we have? We have those functions. Uh, Basic rules about function. Do one thing. Late, well. Mm-hmm.
Now here's something that a friend of mine said to me, and seeing as you do this for a living, I would like your take on it.
Mm-hmm.
He said to me the convention that he uses when he's scripting, because he writes a lot of custom scripts for a flight simulator that we fly together. He said to me that anything that you are going to do more than once, and it's the same thing over and over again, should be put into its own function and then called repeatedly from there, rather than writing the same code over and over.
Yeah,
Is that
definitely.
is
Yeah.
that a good practice?
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Okay, because I started implementing that in the project I'm doing for work, and trying to, because when you gave the example on slide 15, the good and bad function setups, that got me thinking about the subroutines that I use when the return button in my user forms is clicked. And if you were to look at one of them, it admittedly it looks like a mess. There's like 7 lines of variable definitions at the top, and then there's a whole bunch of there's like 7 or 10 range definitions, and then it gets into the code. And so when you hit that point, that was the first thing that jumped into my head, and it's a complete mess. I can send you a screenshot of it if you'd like, but it's bad.
I've seen
So
stuff like that.
yeah, I think it's got to be, God, it's got to be 250 lines long. And I mean, I'm just looking at it right now. I'm like, I see 3 things right now that I could write into their own functions just right away. I don't know if I can do anything about all the variable definitions at the top. Maybe split that up into the various functions that need them. But I have so much work to do to
Yep.
to clean this up. I'm actually really glad you did a class on this particular topic, because at least for myself, I hate going into a line of code and looking at it and knowing the language that it's written in, and like you said, going, what the actual fuck is this? What the hell does this do?
Yeah. And it's a very common mistake, and at different levels of programming even. It doesn't matter beginner or senior, it happens in all levels actually.
Really?
Yes.
That's insane to think that a guy that's been doing this for 20 years would make a mistake like that.
Well,
Because it seems like it's such an obvious, like it's like such an obvious thing that past, you know, past maybe a late beginner or a mildly experienced person, you would stop seeing instances like that of over excessively long functions and things like that.
well, about having long functions, it definitely happens. About not repeating yourself, it doesn't happen. Like the most common thing between developers in general, like the most common mistake that developers make is having too long code, like too long functions, or something which is named not that clearly. That's the biggest mistake, and mistake across all levels of programming. And it happens way less with uh, like the more experienced you are, the higher your level is, but it still happens. That's the one of the biggest problems. But I'm not saying that everyone does this. There are people, really good programmers, who don't, who understand how it's supposed to be done and do it. But the thing is that the focus usually shifts from the clean code. Sometimes, I mean, most of the time you focus on functionality. You want to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
You push for that. You focus on it. Speed is of the essence, and you don't care about the maintainability for the time being, though you should think about long term, and think that even though you spend extra 20 minutes today, you will probably save extra 5 hours in your total development cycle just for splitting that thing up and naming better. So could you refactor this?
Refactor.
I will delete the unnecessary stuff. Wait a minute.
Mm-hmm.
So you have main now, everything in main. So could you refactor this? You have something that you don't know about, and you look at this code, some asshole wrote this who didn't care about anything and just did it. But you don't like it, and you see things you could improve. So what would you do to make this clean?
To clean this up, well, since it looks like it's more or less the same calculation, just on different variables run twice, I'd split both of these in half, or split the whole thing into two, basically. So do
And while you're at it, I will look on Discord since some shit is going on.
Are you getting a lot of beeps?
Something is on fire.
Oh no. Yeah, no. It's- Okay, so how does that look?
As bad. Better, but
That's bad.
almost as bad.
Better, but almost as bad. Okay. So what could I do better here?
So you see code which is almost identical and repeats itself. What do you do?
Try and simplify it into a function as much as possible,
Mm-hmm.
and then call the function.
So instead of calling two
Oh,
different functions here, you could call a single function with different input, and those will go as input.
right. I just noticed that. So I could do. I'm not 100% sure on the proper syntax for naming a variable that's going to be sent to a function, but would it be something? I'm assuming it's something like what you have up at the mains would be.
Well, yeah. No, wait a minute. It's an array what you're doing here. It's just
Oh, okay.
an integer, just
Okay.
a single number, and then another number. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so something like that then.
Yes. So those A and B inside are not needed anymore?
Right. So we can get rid of those. Now, okay, so squiggly line goes away. Okay, and then we could do same thing here. Ah, damn fat fingers. Where'd you go? There you are. All right, so that doesn't work for some reason. That's interesting.
A moment.
That's pretty much still doing the same. Feel like that's still. I mean, because I could. All right, so why didn't that make the you done screwed up AA Ron underscore go away? I don't need to redefine these variables when I enter them, do I? Okay, there it goes. So it just took a second to update.
Okay, let's see.
But that's still calling two separate functions.
Yeah, so how do you solve this? By deleting the second one altogether and calling just one that does the same.
Oh,
And what is
I
calculation
see.
1? Could you tell me what calculation 1 does? Exactly.
It calculates. Okay. All right. I think I catch your meaning.
Yes.
There's,
Can you sum anything else than numbers?
I don't know. I don't think so.
So this part is noise. It doesn't give any info. By reading sum, you will know what it does. It sums numbers. So sum of numbers is noise. It's redundant. It's unneeded.
So then we could just do that.
Um, yep, yep, exactly. And that's it. You see how more clear it is what your code does?
Yes.
And uh, probably, you see, it's not entirely sum. It's sum and log and print. And when you have two words, this would be the actual name of the function, okay?
Okay.
Because it prints. But when you have word end in your function, then it should just go to another function. So you would print void print num1 or a and b and result sum of the two. And
but would having, oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, even though it's repetitive, it's needed. So in your case, you would see sum1 is this, and then sum2 is this. And the sum function returns a sum. So it's an integer. It returns sum1. I don't have to write it like this. I could just write it like this. So I take sum, and then I print the stuff that I did. A, B, and sum. A, B, and sum. More like this. Though this again you shouldn't have those magic numbers, but this is a trivial case. But you get my point. A function should do one thing and do it well. This is a function for sum, and it does it perfectly, and it cannot fail ever. A change might happen, but it won't mess anything up. In any case, printing I'll just call it and print. So at least it's a different step. It's a bit better. So var sum is this, and then you return sum, and then you print sum as well. So A, B, and sum. Sum and print. And lay it for you, and you understand what it does.
So in trying to avoid magic numbers,
yeah.
For example, using the 5 and 6 and 1 and 2 we have up there, would the ideal scenario then be that before those two lines are called, like you would have a variable that's assigned to each of those numbers then, and then you would just call the variable when you're sending the numbers to be added together to the function?
Yes, in our case right now there is no context, so it's hard to tell how it will be used. But
Right. But in
usually,
every other situation.
yeah, it usually has a meaning, and it usually is retrieved from someplace. It could be hard-coded. I mean, magic numbers altogether means that they are some values from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of some 1, let's imagine that this is total apples, and the 5 is, like I said, constant, named constant. So Kentucky warehouse apples in Kentucky is 5. Apples in Oregon is 6. So then total apples is you sum the two together. Now they get meaning. They're no longer magical numbers. You know what 5 and 6 is for.
Mm-hmm.
So, yep. And you can look at the structure. So, don't do something like this. Apples in more like bananas in Kentucky, bananas in Oregon. Bananas. In Oregon too. This is dirty because you might think, hey, I define my variables at the top. I'll keep it consistent and I'll define it, declare it at the top. And that's a bad thing because I read this, and before I actually use this, I need to go through noise, which is this. So instead, it should be there. Also separated with a space, with an empty line, so that I can clearly see. I mean, this is a different calculation and a different logical concept, and it should be separated with an empty line. And now, right before I used those, I defined them, I declared them. Not anywhere at the top, but just before I used them. And that's how it should be done.
Aha. Okay.
Because now
that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, because now I need to read about this to know what the value is, and it's right next to it. If it was up there, I would need to imagine
go through a bunch of noise.
Yeah.
You could lose your place.
Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
And this is also a common mistake, common beginner mistake.
Yeah, I'll say, because like using the code that I have as an example, I've got all my declarations up top, I've got all this stuff, and then below all of that is where I start actually checking to see what needs to be put where and when and why. So if I'm down here, like for example, for one of the checkboxes, all right, I see. All right, well, that's all pretty straightforward just because it's only referencing checkbox. Okay, all right, so I see it's referencing a variable labeled CONF. So if I look at this and I don't know what CONF represents, I have to scroll all the way back up to the top of the sub, and there's CONF right there. Okay, so now I know what it means. Now I have to go all the way back down. I have to find my place. Okay, here's where I was. So what you did here makes a lot of sense. And I think the only reason that